Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm not on the program. My name is James Wood, and I've been added. And I'm delighted to be speaking to Nicholas Boggs today about his magnificent James Baldwin biography. Nick, I really don't know quite where to begin. It's a big book, and it's an incredibly rich life. But one way in might be to start with a little epilogue you have, a personal statement, really, at the end of the book, where you talk about being a kid in Washington, D.C., and seeing a painting of James Baldwin in a classroom. And you go on to talk about beginning to read him, how important it was for you as a young man to read Baldwin. And then you have a lovely line in which you say that one of the things that really draws you to Baldwin is that he didn't treat racism as an isolated form of oppression, that it was always intertwined for him with other layers of oppression. And I just wondered if you might talk a little bit about that, because it's such a central theme in your book.
Sure. I'm honored to be here in conversation with you. It is great to be back in Key West. I actually wrote a lot of this book in Key West over several trips. So a special thanks to the literary seminar and the studios. I actually typed the words "the end" in Key West 2 years ago. So it's great to be back. Yeah, so that author's note, I grew up in Washington, D.C., the son of a civil rights lawyer, and I attended D.C. public schools, and on the walls of one of my eighth grade English classroom was a drawing of James Baldwin, actually, and I was immediately taken with these enormous eyes, although during book tour I met with my English teacher, and she said, "No, Nick, you actually, that happened, but also you got dressed up in a suit, came to your public school, and gave a whole talk on Baldwin's life in eighth grade." So, so I guess the origins were really there, and then the next year, in ninth grade, I borrowed my twin sister's copy of Giovanni's Room, which was an important book for me, as it was for many sort of gay men, bisexual men, whatever, trying to understand their identities. And so what Baldwin did is he brought together these two parts of my experience in my life. You know, civil rights discourse was happening all around me, around the dining room table, and my parents marched on Washington, et cetera. And then this part of myself that I was trying to understand, that I came to understand better by reading James Baldwin, but I also came to understand, whiteness. He was the greatest writer, Nell Painter followed in his footsteps, but one of our great writers on whiteness as a social construct, whiteness as a sort of pernicious force in the United States history. Right. So having both of that together was really helpful for me.
Right, it's what you call, I think, the false security of white American masculinity, that Baldwin is always as interested in whiteness as he is in blackness.
That's right, because he sees them as, mirroring each other and constructing each other through the other one. You can't have whiteness without blackness. You can't have heterosexuality without homosexuality, man, woman. All those binaries Baldwin was kind of deconstructing and writing about in different ways.
And this didn't, to put it mildly, this did not make life easy for Baldwin. I mean, it could be said, reading the long arc of your book, it could be said that repeatedly people fail to understand his particular treatment of the entanglements of race and the entanglements of sexuality. And as we know, in the 60s, when Baldwin becomes a major figure in the civil rights movement, he pays pretty heavily, both just at the level of homophobia, but he pays, I think, heavily also because people, including maybe the FBI, can't make sense of what they want to put him in one position or another, and he just won't stay still.
That's right. Although he, one of the wonderful things about him is he kind of took these so-called negative attributes and turned them into great art. So one interviewer asked him at a certain point, you grew up black, poor, and gay, homosexual, like, how was that? It must have been awful. And he said, I hit the jackpot because I have all of these incredible perspectives and experiences. And I think it's also one of the reasons that he's so beloved by so many people is that everybody has some form of oppression that they probably experience, and Baldwin has probably experienced that on some level, and you see that reflected, but beautifully and complexly and deeply in his writing.
Yeah. It's a wonderful story. You bring out the politics. Of course, you couldn't do anything else. But just humanly, it's what a great tale. And I love the way you begin the book begins pretty much, well, I wouldn't say in the middle of things because it's early in Baldwin's life, but it doesn't begin with, James Baldwin was born in. It actually begins with this wonderful moment of Baldwin's beloved white teacher at his public school in Harlem who had seen the intelligence and promise in this boy, taking him to a Betty Davis movie, where you tell the story, but it's a wonderful way to begin the book.
Sure. So I always knew I wanted to start the book with this image and this moment. Even though Baldwin was so precocious, reading A Tale of Two Cities when he was 9, reading Harriet Beecher Stowe and the Bible when he was 5. His parents had to hide these books from him. So he was recognized by teachers, black and white, from a very young age as being brilliant and precocious. But there was this one teacher in particular who was coming into the school to teach drama, actually. And she and the principal of the school noticed that Baldwin was way ahead of his classmates and said, "Can you kind of go with her?" And go with her he did. They went to see movies and plays, and she really opened up the world to him. And one of the movies that was is it 30,000 or 20,000 Years in Sing Sing, starring Betty Davis. And Baldwin had been told growing up by his stepfather that he was the ugliest boy in the world, that he had frog eyes. And Baldwin's eyes were very similar to his mother's eyes. So seeing Betty Davis on screen and seeing her eyes, which were just like his mother's eyes, which were just like his eyes, made him realize, A, that his mother was the most beautiful woman in the world, as he thought, but also that his eyes were a source of beauty, but more importantly, a source of power and a source of witnessing. He called them his weapons, and that was a big, big moment for him.
And that teacher, it wasn't so easy. You would think it would be easy to take a young lad under your wing and make him your product. It wasn't easy because Baldwin's pretty horrendous stepfather, the so-called preacher, didn't really want her in the house, right?
That's right. She stopped by the house once and opened the door, and she just saw this enormous clothesline and this steam-filled kitchen and little faces of Baldwin's eventually 8 siblings peeking out from behind the linen, the clothing. And she'd never really encountered such poverty before. And the parents weren't home. She was told to come back. And she came back. She sat down in the living room with the mother and the father. And the father was never wanted white people in the house because he called them the devils, because usually it was sort of corrupt welfare workers who were coming in with really bad news. But the mother, I think, recognized, A, that Baldwin was this amazingly precocious talent, and B, that he needed to get out into the world and to see and to be exposed to this. So she and Baldwin sort of worked together, and she said, well, it would be a shame for this nice woman to come all this way and not, let him go out into the world. So Baldwin was very, very close to his mother, Bertis, and she was an important source of survival and love for him.
And then this teacher continued, took him to plays and films and so on, right?
She did, and he would go over to her house. She would take him and his siblings to get ice cream, and if the policemen wouldn't serve them to them, but only to the white kids, she would sort of sternly look at them and make sure they did it. It was because of her, Baldwin said, and these are his words, that I was never able to hate white people, although I did wish to murder more than one or two.
It's a lovely thing in your book. I put a bookmark in it because I just wanted to read it. It's just these are the pleasures of just making your way through 300-400 pages of text. The teacher, this wonderful teacher, Arilla, known as Bill Miller, disappears for a while. Baldwin begins to write his early works, becomes quite famous in the early 60s, and the teacher comes back. The teacher sees him speaking in, I think it's 1963, and then writes this lovely letter to him that you quote. It's very moving, 1963. James, I want to tell you that the promise of the wonderful child has been fulfilled in the man. I'm not referring alone to the development of your writing ability, the incisive use of your intelligence in social commentary. I'm referring to the moral you, in the broad sense of one's individual relationship to man around him. That Evan and I, her husband, had a small part in your life adds to the value of ours. I also say thank you that this is the James Baldwin in America in the year 1963. However, if the schedule you maintained in LA is representative of your present life, I am quite fearful. You will be destroyed physically or creatively. What a wonderful letter to receive from your teacher. It was just, I was very moved by that. Maybe it's because I'm the son of a school teacher. My mum was a school teacher. So these sorts of interactions between, and she actually taught 12-year-olds, so that sort of interaction between kids and teachers is meaningful to me.
Yeah, they fell out of touch because Baldwin became a child preacher and told her that he could no longer go to the movies. And then she was writing him letters that he never, to his publisher early on, and he never got them. And then finally that didn't get through. Finally, she saw him, and he was so moved. What happens after that is he tries to see her afterwards, and he is sort of swept up by the people he's with to go to another event. And it sort of is a metaphor for how he's being swept up in the tides of the civil rights movement and history at that moment. That's right when he's sort of at his peak, almost at his peak of his fame with the publication of The Fire Next Time.
Yeah. Let's go back, just so that the audience can move at least through the early life sort of chronologically. He gets out of Harlem and sort of escapes to Greenwich Village, where there begins a series of, I mean, this is a great theme of your book, whose subtitle is a love story, a series of relationships, sometimes platonic, sometimes erotic, sometimes fleeting, sometimes long-lived, with people who, in the terms of which both you put it in the book, but also Baldwin himself tended to put it, might or might not be able to save him. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as the great theme of your book?
Yeah, it took me many, many years. I never set out to write a biography. I was writing about one particular late-in-life relationship, and I slowly realized that there was these gaps in Baldwin's life, particularly around his love life, which really helped explain all his work, because all of his novels are love stories. His political writing is actually about how it's love between black and white Americans that can help save the country. And there were these major relationships he had, 4 of them that I focus on, with people that he said saved his life and who he loved him. He dedicated novels to them, or he collaborated with them. And the first one is Buford Delaney, the amazing black American painter who was not so well known then, but now his paintings sell for millions of dollars. But he was this eccentric figure in the village who took Baldwin under his wing, introduced him to blues and jazz when he was 16, painted gorgeous portraits of him, introduced him to Marian Anderson, who was his friend backstage, let him know that this whole world of culture was open to him, and that also black music was culture, was art. And he also said, so Baldwin later said, that all great art is created out of love, and there was no greater lover than Buford Delaney. Now, they did not have a romantic relationship. He considered him his quote-unquote spiritual father, but it was laced with this unrequited interest on the part of Buford in Baldwin, but he accepted this role as his spiritual father. The other relationships, it was reversed. It was these love affairs that Baldwin had with men who were predominantly heterosexual, would get married and have wives, but Baldwin was this kind of exceptional figure in their lives. They had relationships with him, many of them. So the first one was Lucien Happersberger, to whom he dedicated Giovanni's Room. He met him in Paris when Lucien was 17 and Baldwin was 24, and Lucien took him to a Swiss chalet in Switzerland, and that's where he wrote Go Tell on the Mountain. He also wrote about that experience in The Stranger in the Village. And they had a lifelong back and forth relationship that was very, very complicated. And he ended up having an affair and marrying Diana Sands while he was performing in Baldwin's play, Blues for Mr. Charlie. So these love triangles that you see in Baldwin's books are very much in his life as well. Then Engin Cezar, this famous Turkish actor who played Giovanni in an actor's studio rendition in Greenwich Village, Baldwin followed him to Istanbul in 1961, and that is where he finished Another Country. That is where he wrote The Fire Next Time, and people don't usually know this, but he spent most of the 60s in Istanbul. He called it his home. He created this kind of family structure over there. There's actually a Turkish rug right here. I don't know if this was put out just for me and today, but thank you. You guys can't see it, but it's beautiful. And then the fourth figure was his last great love, which really started the whole journey for me. Joran Kazak, a French painter, a protege of Balthus, who Baldwin ended up dedicating If Beale Street Could Talk to him, and also collaborating with him on a children's book in the 70s.
And that was how that children's book and that great collaboration that was how you really began your interest, and it's really why we have this book now, right?
Yeah, it was a very wild experience. I mean, it was in 2000, when I was an undergrad at Yale, I wrote to David Leeming, Baldwin's personal assistant and his first great biographer, and he had one paragraph about this children's book and this French artist named Joran Kazak. So I sent the first email of my life in 1996. Dear Professor Leeming, can you tell me more about Joran Kazak and this children's book? And he said, I never met him. I don't know anybody still alive who met him, and I believe he's dead. I said, okay. 7 years later, 2003, I'm in New York City getting my PhD, Columbia, and I decided to send some more emails to art historians in Paris. Do you know anything about this deceased French painter, Joran Kazak? Here's my number. I'm completely broke in grad school. I'm sitting, 3 months later, the phone rings. It's a raspy, French-accented voice saying, I'm Joran Kazak, I'm alive, come to Paris. I have many stories to tell you about
great.
Jimmy. I signed up for my third credit card, and I went to Paris. And to be perfectly honest, it's been an incredible experience, but for many years as I struggled to write this, I was cursing the fact that I ever received that phone call, because it took over my entire adult life.
And I mean, it's a big thing to write a big biography. It's taken over your life. There were interesting questions which I was sort of reading between the lines. There seem to be interesting questions about, should we say, difficult questions about access to letters, I would suspect. Sometimes you seem to be not quoting from letters, but, say, quoting critics who have got access to letters, which makes you think, oh, the estate is holding something back. Then there's the fact that permissions to quote things cost a lot of money. In the end, it's a hiding to nowhere. I mean, you bankrupted yourself, right?
Donations are accepted for these permissions were extremely expensive, both for the archives that I quoted from, but also for the images. There are a lot of images in the insert that have never been seen before, some really beautiful and important ones. And I also really pushed for color, because I really felt it was important for us to remember that the civil rights movement was not in black and white. It wasn't a long time ago, that it happened quite recently, which is why those issues are still here with us. But yes, the Schomburg archives acquired Baldwin's massive papers in 2017, and I got the book contract in 2018. The Beinecke also has a bunch of it, but you're not allowed to photograph those. You can transcribe everything from there, but that takes hours. I mean, and the archive is enormous. So a lot of my time was spent at the Schomburg. Thankfully, they supported me with a fellowship. And then the harder part in writing the book really was figuring out what was essential to quote from, how to weave that in with other sources, how to weave that in with my own narrative. I mean, I went to many of the places that Baldwin spent time. It was really awful, you guys. I had to go to the south of France. I had to go to Tuscany, to go to Istanbul. But the book was written in such a way that I took Bob Caro's advice very seriously about you have to turn every page, and you also have to go to every place.
Yeah, I mean that's very evident reading the book. So if we just go back a bit, we have Baldwin in Paris, and he's beginning a pattern both emotionally, erotically, but also geographically that will really characterize the rest of his life. He felt he had to leave America. He goes to Paris, I think it is in 1948, does come back in 55, but for a while. But as you were saying, in the 60s he's in Istanbul. For much of the 70s, he's in the south of France. He dies in the south of France in 1987. All right, let's go back to Paris. As you were saying, what begins there, in addition to the relationships he has with friends and lovers, is a thing he clearly needs, which is he needs to be somewhere else, somewhere other than America, to finish work. So as you were saying, he's in Switzerland, where he finishes Go Tell It on the Mountain. He's in, I think, Istanbul, where he finishes Another Country, and so on.
Exactly.
Where did he write Fire Next Time? Was that?
He wrote much of that in Istanbul,
Okay.
right after Another Country was
Right.
published, and it's interesting to look at them together because people often talk about Baldwin, the great essayist, which is sort of, there's no argument against that,
Right.
but his novels are sometimes considered secondary. And one of the interesting things, if you're going through the letters like I was, and you're putting together a book like this, you see how much he's thinking of them together, and how much he couldn't have written The Fire Next Time without having written Another Country. The Fire Next Time, which says black and white Americans must come together like lovers. Well, he just explored in Another
Right.
Country the kind of the messiness of what that looks like. But yes, you're right. There's a beautiful short film of him done in Istanbul by Sedat Pekai, where he talks about it's from another place that he can see America more clearly. But also, when he moved to France, not only was he afraid for his life, his
Right.
best friend had jumped off the George Washington Bridge, his father had died, he just saw many black men facing impossible odds. He also really felt that the linguistic alienation, he enjoyed being in a place where he didn't know the language. In fact, one of the reasons that he eventually left France was because he learned French too well. And he wanted to be in Istanbul, where he never learned the language, I think, on purpose, because this kind of linguistic estrangement was a vantage point from which he could focus and think back on where he came from, America.
Yeah. But crucially, in 1955, he does come back from France. There's an offer from the Partisan Review and maybe other places to go to the South, which he's never been to before. It's the old country for him, as he describes it. To go down there and report on what's happening with the desegregation of schools and so on. And as you were saying, I mean, he feels called to it, but he's also, with good reason, afraid to go there.
He was a slight man, and he was afraid, but he was also very ambivalent about getting involved in the civil rights movement. He wanted to be an artist. I mean, he wanted to be a novelist and a playwright, and this is what he felt called to do. But once that trip south in 1957, his first trip south, was very important. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that he'd never been, because so much of Go Tell It in the Mountain is based on people in the South and migrating. But when he went in 1957, he was really radicalized. He was transformed politically in a couple ways. I mean, first of all, just seeing the burning crosses and seeing how Jim Crow was functioning. But then he attended the black church down there and met Martin Luther King for the first time. And he had kind of stepped away from the church he was a child preacher, and then he gave that up back when he was a teenager. But it was in this church that he had missed it, and he understood that the church could be a place not only of religious connection, but more importantly to him, a place of community, and even more importantly to him, a place of political mobilization. So that first trip south transformed him, and he realized that there was no way he could not write about and be involved in the civil rights movement.
Right. And out of this trip, and thinking about it afterwards, of course, because it's a few years after that trip, comes the great essay, The Fire Next Time, published in 1962 in over 80 or so pages in the New Yorker. Massive thing a major moment, I think, in the history of that magazine.
Yes.
As the editor then understood, and then published in book form next year in The Fire Next Time. And that really is, I mean, just in terms of his prestige, that's perhaps the high point of his career. Actually, you'll be amused by this. In an essay class that I teach The Fire Next Time, and there was a 80 or so year old auditor who I got to know very well at the back of the room, great guy. He comes up to me after The Fire Next Time, and he hands me a paperback of it, and he says, "I want you to have this." And I said, "Well, thank you very much." And he said, "It's from 1963, or maybe 1964." And I said, "Well, thank you. Sure you can spare it?" And then he said, I was an incoming freshman in the year of 1963, and there were 3 set books that all freshmen at Harvard had to read. And one of them was, it's a nonfiction book that I've forgotten the title of, about nuclear annihilation. And the other 2 books were Thomas Mann's Death in Venice and The Fire Next Time.
Wow.
1963. So And his face was on the cover of Time
Exactly.
and so on. But more importantly than the celebrity and risk that came with that, obviously, because he was a target, is that lovely essay with, as you say, the still quite pacific ending of the possibility of love and cohabitation between the races. That begins to change a bit through the 60s with certain events.
Right. Right. The murders, many events, but the murders of Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X were devastating for Baldwin. I mean, he not only did he care for these men very much, he was afraid for his own life. The truth is, the FBI was there were massive files on Baldwin, and the FBI was following him across on these transatlantic journeys that he was doing. They're saying really awful things about him. The only good thing about the FBI files for a biographer is that they got lots of stuff wrong. Like for a second, they thought he was married to his sister, and they called another country another world, and go tell it to the mountain, that kind of stuff. But their records of his travels were, they know where he landed when in Istanbul. They know when he landed in France. So I was able to use the FBI files against themselves, to write this book.
But they can't make sense of him, right? That's I thought that was so symptomatic that they don't know. They want to, and this happens throughout the 60s, right? People want to place him, and it would seem, I guess, if you're just doing a crude thing, in what, like 1957 to 1963, broadly speaking, you might say politically, it's Martin Luther King's message we can only be saved by love. Then that begins to change, as you were saying, after things like Malcolm X's assassination. What does Baldwin become politically after? Right, everyone can make sense. Everyone loves a message about how we all need to get along, and the loving kindness and so on. Then Baldwin, in some sense, becomes not only less comprehensible, but less lovable politically.
Well, he becomes, at least what he always said is that he was a witness. That's what what he considered his vocation in the world to be. And so I think he was witnessing the failures of the civil rights movement. He was witnessing the failure of white America to do what they promised to do. And so by 1972, when he writes what I think is one of his best books, No Name on the Street, he's doing two things at once. He has a more global vision of black liberation. For one, he's definitely closer to Malcolm X's positions and the Black Panthers. But at the same time, in the way that only Baldwin can do, he has all this political stuff happening, but he's also going back and writing about his childhood and writing about his early experiences and reconsidering the place of his sexuality, of his gender, stuff like that. So in the 70s, he was moving into these really interesting places as an artist and writer at the precise moment that the critical establishment was trying to discredit him quite successfully, calling him passé. I mean, Henry Louis Gates went to... a very young Henry Louis Gates went and did an interview for Time magazine of Josephine Baker and James Baldwin, and they wouldn't publish it. They said, well, they're both passé at this point. The same thing happened when his novel Just Above My Head came out in 1979. 2020 filmed an incredible segment going to his house. His mother was there. And it wasn't aired because they said that nobody cares about a black homosexual Negro, what they said. So he had to deal with this kind of zeitgeist around his work, and it's only been in the last 10, 15 years or so that scholars have kind of tried to recuperate successfully his later writing. This was a very sharp narrative of decline that followed him late in life.
Right. I think I even remember that from a completely different place, England in the 1980s, going to university. I think he was at a sort of nadir, really, of, and yet, as you're saying, the last 10, 15 years, he's become absolutely central. What do you put that down to? Apart from the quality, obviously, of the work.
Yeah, I think he is a first-rate artist, so his work stands the test of time, for one thing. But secondly, obviously, the rise of Black Lives Matter has had a big impact. But just Raoul Peck's documentary, I'm Not Your Negro, was terrific, and I think brought back If Beale Street Could Talk, I think was.
Right.
I also think, for better or worse, he was so magnetic on stage and on screen that he is kind of a good figure for our social media age. There's a lot of, you post, you can't stop watching him. It also means there's a lot of examples of people misquoting him or thinking that somebody else is saying what he said, somebody else said it actually. So there's that problem.
Right, I know exactly what you mean. Like Hannah Arendt, who also sees her stock rising, doesn't do so well on the real front because Hannah Arendt's usually talking in German,
Exactly. Whereas
Baldwin with the great accent, thrashing Buckley in debate is worth seeing. So he gets more pessimistic, perhaps, but he. Well, it's a complicated thing. One image of it that comes to mind is I can't remember the exact date. In I think it's in the 60s, when he's on TV with Reinhold Niebuhr.
Yes.
And I thought that was a very interesting moment of how hard it is to pin him down, because the two men, the distinguished theologian, the distinguished novelist and essayist, agree about a lot.
Yes.
In contemporary America, race relations, civil rights, and so on. Then the question of nonviolent protest is brought up. And it's very interesting because there's some way in which Baldwin clearly is not at all violent and officially, and perhaps more than officially, agrees with Niebuhr that nonviolent protest is important, but then can't help playing the gadfly. Do you want to just describe that, because it's so interesting?
Yeah, I believe this was after the Birmingham bombing, so Baldwin was extremely upset. And they did agree about a lot, but Baldwin made the point, he said, everybody wants to preach nonviolence in terms of when black people have guns, but when white people have guns, violence is okay. I mean, that was sort of his, which we're seeing right now in our country and world. So, I do think he wanted to practice nonviolence ideally, but I also thought he was very frustrated and could understand, and he also understood that the Black Panthers and Black nationalists were doing all kinds of other things that were not even about violence. They were creating supportive communities. They were creating educational systems. They were creating safe houses and stuff like that. That it was very simplified. I mean, he really was impressed by people like Huey Newton, for example. So he wasn't going to throw them under the bus in these kinds of conversations. There was a funny thing, slightly tragic funny thing about their talk too. I think that was also the one, it was around Christmas time, and Baldwin wanted to cancel Christmas because of what had happened, and his interlocutor was like, no way can you do that. And Baldwin said, okay, it's Christmas, but you can only play Ray Charles Christmas songs.
So in this, so continually, as I read your book, I see him in the late 60s sort of, and throughout the 70s, paying a price for this complexity. He gets increasingly poorly reviewed. There's a feeling that the movement has that he's passé, that they've moved on. It's not the same issue. That whatever. There he is in the south of France, and on the one hand, in terms of the career, things are in, I suppose, some sort of decline, but humanly, it's one of the loveliest things at the end of your book, and I haven't read it in this way. I haven't read this kind of account of it before. I mean, he rolls up in the south of France and starts renting a room from a woman who is actually she's a Pied Noir Algerian woman, so a former French colonist in Algeria, and she's racist. She's fearful of Baldwin, doesn't like him, and it's this woman that through sheer charm he wins around. And there's a beautiful thing where you quote the postman in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, who says, first year maybe he was a kind of strange dude, this Jimmy Baldwin, and certainly Madame Faure didn't like him at all. She was a racist, nasty woman. But within a few years, he wasn't black, he wasn't left, he was just Jimmy. Everyone loved him. And it's a lovely ending, or almost ending, to your book. And it just reminds you what an amazing, magnetic charm he must have had to pull people to him.
Yes, that, and also one of the things that I wanted to stress in the book, in addition to this narrative, I think, of decline, which is premature and unfair, there's also sometimes a narrative of this tragic life that Baldwin led. Right. When in fact, reading through his letters, I mean, he lived a profoundly human life, but he also had these incredible relationships with men and with women, with Lorraine Hansberry, right. with Toni Morrison. People would come and visit him in the south of France and stay in Chez Baldwin. And there was a lot of laughter and community, and I just wanted to really stress that in the book, not to sort of just say, oh, he was happier than you thought, but also it was these relationships that inspired and sustained him and allowed him to create all the amazing works that he did. But Richard Avedon was just shocked by Baldwin, how he could sit in bars and have conversations with intensely racist people and not get angry and just try to understand them. And what he was doing was he was figuring out how the racist white mind worked so he can go back and write about it, which he did time and time again.
Yeah. And you must have meditated on this much more than me just reading a book, obviously. But reading your book, I kept on thinking, what does the example of Baldwin's work in life, what can we do with it today? We're in very difficult times in all sorts of ways, and we don't have to assign political positions here on stage to those difficulties. Yeah. They're multifarious, but we're in pretty difficult times. And one would long for a Baldwin-like writer to be here. Yeah. What do you feel can be learned from this?
Well, I always avoid answering the question, what would he say about our moment? But I do think we can learn two things. One, from his later work, which I can talk about in a second, but also, very importantly, that he was willing to change his mind. Baldwin there are many examples of it. For one of them is Palestine. He changed his mind after visiting Palestine. He changed his mind about the civil rights movement. He moved further to the left after seeing that Martin Luther King approach wasn't working. He really changed his mind about gender. I mean, some of Baldwin's early interviews, if you watch them, can be sort of problematic in terms of how he's talking about women and the role of women in the civil rights movement, et cetera. But by later in his life, he's writing about gender in terms that we're only now as a culture coming to terms with. He was writing about how we're all androgynous. Each contains the other, male and female and male, black and white and black. So even the kind of trans and non-binary identities that we're grappling with now are something that he was actively thinking about in the last decade of his life. So he was changing his mind. I think he was impacted by feminists and black feminists like Audre Lorde and Nikki Giovanni. But he also was writing, in closing, I would just say, you can look to what he was writing later in his life, both in terms of gender, but also he was writing about, in his final play, about the AIDS epidemic, actually. But I think most interestingly, in a way, is in his much maligned final nonfiction book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, about the Atlanta child murders, which was a little bit of a mess, but he wrote 25, 30 books. You're allowed to have a messy book or two. But what he was grappling with there is what we are grappling with now, which is this kind of the visual field through our phones, through the constant information. We're being bombarded with images of suffering, right? I think about the murder that just happened in Minnesota. You think about all the black people who have been shot and teenagers, over the last few years. Baldwin was already thinking, what does it mean to deal with a media that had once upon a time ignored black people, and now we have a media system that's saturated with suffering, that our young people can just open their phones and see their peers being killed. I mean, that is something that we very much have to draw on Baldwin and others to confront today.
Right. Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure, and thank you for writing this great book.
Thank you for reading it.